Very good. So if there are no further questions...
Jocelyn, can you turn your...
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions on this, then we will move on to the first of, I guess, the key questions or considerations that we need to ask you today. So the preliminary consideration that we are looking for a steer from you on is, do you want to modify your initial proposal based on the consultation feedback?
Yes. Can we just show of hands? Also. Yep.
Oh, excellent. And we are now live streaming. With that in mind, here is the direction that we will need from you today. We will need, and by way of a straw poll like you just did, or a show of hands is very helpful for us, thank you. So today we will need you to confirm your views on the size of the council, so the mayor and how many councillors. So 10 councillors is the direction that we've had from you previously, and we'll need you to confirm that. We'll also need you to confirm whether you want to retain the mixed model of ward and district-wide councillors. I wonder, Mr Mayor, if it's worth a straw poll on those 2 points to start with.
Can we take the first one, size of council, mayor and 10 councils?
So just for clarity, that's the status quo that you're asking?
That's right, mayor and 10 councils.
Can I ask a question to that?
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned the other day, I think it's important before we actually decide on the number of councillors to be able to know that it's going to fit into any particular model that we might be moving forward with, rather than just pulling numbers out of the air.
The opposite would also be true, probably more likely to be true, that your views on what is the appropriate size of your council will determine what options you then have on the table in terms of ward structure or mixed model or that kind of thing.
Let's get that straight. The first one, affirmative mayor and 10 councillors.
So I think there seems to be a majority view that that's the direction that we head in. So we'll proceed on that basis for the rest of today's conversation.
Next one, mixed model ward and district-wide councils.
Can I speak on this? I've just said.
Yep.
So I'm not going to vote for this, and based on, I'm still going to support the proposal put forward 2 days ago for 10 councillors at large on the basis of the feedback I've had from community board members in the last 24 hours.
Oh.
When I sent them an email about just letting them know what I was thinking, and I've had fully responsive and good feedback from all of them, from all my responses.
Well,
so
you're entitled to whatever you're saying.
yeah.
I haven't had that feedback at all. To the contrary.
No, you wouldn't because you haven't had the conversation.
I have had conversations along the line with them before. Right, back to the point, mixed model ward and district-wide councils. Yes, Councillor Brogna.
So I'm not going to put my hand up either because I'm uncertain on this, but just in response to Councillor Elliott's comments, I think when she sent her email out, it was with one option. It didn't actually include all the other options.
Sorry, I didn't explain about the option.
And so they couldn't actually compare it with what else was being discussed, which they couldn't do. So I think it's cherry picking, if I may say so, in terms of the responses you got.
Right, your views have been noted. I go back to the point, mixed model ward and district-wide councillors. Straw poll. Majority.
Thank you. It's helpful to have that direction as we move through the rest of the workshop. I believe that the other points that we will need your direction on by the end of the workshop, your direction will probably come after we have put some information in front of you for consideration around the ward structure and the treatment of community boards. So I would suggest at this stage that we move on to putting some of that information in front of you and come back to the remainder of these questions later in the workshop, if that is acceptable,
Yep.
Mr Mayor.
Well, are you all right with that?
Yep.
Cool. So, having done the easy part and introducing it, I'm now going to hand over to Sarah and other members of the team. Sarah, do you want to come and sit up here? Is that easier? You and I can swap seats for a bit. Yes, come on up.
Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. Based on our discussion earlier in the week and the different concepts that we need direction on today, we have put together 3 different options to have a look at today, which respond to the consultation feedback as well as the combination of the earlier preliminary engagement and consultation feedback that we've received. So,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, the first part, based on the comments made by the when we went out to consultation. But what we decided before we went out for consultation, legally, should we be looking at that part, or we just should be looking at the view? I think Janice mentioned it this morning. We should just be looking at the views. Does it fit in with the views that we received from the community?
So, thank you for your question. So, just in relation to that, so if we were in a situation where we hadn't received any submissions, then it wouldn't be appropriate to make changes to the initial proposal. We're in a position where we've received 500 and I think it is at 31 or 34 submissions with a range of different views. So the majority of views are fairly strong, but there are some clear themes that have come through in feedback. And I guess if you were to sum it up, and I think some councillors used these words earlier in the week, there's a rejection of the initial proposal. So it is entirely appropriate to look at the initial proposal now and to make changes to the initial proposal. That could include adopting a different model that was explored earlier in the process, or indeed a model which is an adjustment to the status quo, which is one of the options that we'll be looking at. So from a legal perspective, it absolutely is appropriate, and in fact, I think there's a strong argument that it would be continuing with the initial proposal would be subject to challenge, and I think highly likely there'd be appeals or objections on based on the submission feedback. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Can I just also add something there, Sarah?
Yes.
The other piece that probably I wasn't as clear on as I should have been at the start of the session was that what we are bringing to the table today is the result of feedback that councillors gave us at a session where we were drilling deeper into the consultation feedback earlier in the week. So it is feedback from councillors that has determined what we're putting on the table today. Thank you, Janice. So just to go back, just to start off. Sorry,
Martin, Councillor Holiday.
I just wanted to ask, the maps that we had last time that had the delineations of the borders and everything like that, they're still relevant, aren't they? Yeah, just wondering if we could possibly have those popped up on the wall so we can have it as well. It'd be much appreciated.
Mr. Mayor, can I confirm whether there are any councillors missing from that last workshop?
I think Councillor Randall was on.
I was not absent.
Oh, you were not? I thought you were on Zoom.
Well, you can check with
Yeah.
you can check with staff. They would know if I was present or not.
I thought you might have been on Zoom, but there was no one on Zoom.
Tuesday.
Oh, sorry, yesterday. No, I was
Tuesday.
medical.
Not yesterday. Tuesday. It was.
Councillor Rundle was away on Tuesday.
So can I get that clear? Councillor Randall was not here on Tuesday.
Yes, correct. Yep.
Right. Does that answer your question? Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So that we can focus on the options before us, and in fairness to Councillor Elliott, 2 other proposals were suggested on Tuesday. So can both, and they were opposing views, can we both have some, I suppose, some feedback as to why they're actually off the table, just for transparency, please?
Sure. So, Janice.
Can I just say that my understanding was a straw poll was taken. Each councillor a straw poll was taken to indicate majority leanings for the staff to take into account, and I cannot second guess each mind of the councillors what the specific reasons were.
That was going to be my response, that's a matter for councillors to consider rather than for staff.
So what you're saying, Mr Mayor, is that there was no reasons in behind
No, what I'm saying
those
is
2 options being taken?
each councillor would have had their own specific combination, a cocktail of reasons why they've chosen to do what they did.
Okay, thank you.
Your Worship.
Councillor Coates.
I mean, other councillors may want to comment, but my understanding was that Councillor Elliott put forward a model that she felt should be considered. It was discussed on Tuesday, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I thought that we agreed to put 2 models forward to be brought forward to today in terms of the work that we were done. There was discussion around the 3rd model, but that the numbers around the table didn't support that, and I thought that Ms McDougall responded that it would start to get messy if we were trying to bring 3 models back and so forth. So, I mean, that was my recollection of the day. It wasn't that it wasn't considered, but we worked through the different aspects of the wards, of the numbers, the community boards, all of those different aspects to land us in a position today to be able to get down to the nitty gritty. So, I'm again happy to be corrected by my colleagues.
That is my recollection, Mr Mayor, that we all discussed, specifically Councillor Pravanos as well, and we decided not to, and we decided to move forward with 2. So I'm not keen on relitigating a decision we've already made that was very clear.
Well, that I think the staff said they will respond to that. Yeah. Okay, see, I think the staff will said that they will respond to that. Moving along.
Mr Mayor, can I make a personal statement?
You can speak. I'm not sure about your personal statement.
Well, I'm objecting to Councillor McCann. As a matter of a record, twice he's asked if I was present. Twice I was having operations in the hospital. I had written to the staff informing them of that, and I think it's not the correct protocol to be asking those questions in public, and that I have to justify my medical history in public as this is being live streamed. I strongly object to his 2 questions, Mr Mayor, and I hope he's not laughing. But I strongly object.
Councillor Randall, you raised an issue. It's been noted. Can we move along, please? And I think the question was raised more generically than specific. Moving along.
Are you happy for me to continue?
Yes.
Yep, great. All right. So I might just start by recapping on the options that we'll take you through based on the feedback that we received, I think, from majority of councillors earlier in the week. And so there are 2 different ward-based options, but we're presenting 3 different options. So I'll just take you through what they are before I go into the detail of each, just so we're all clear. So number 1.
Hello.
Number one, so we'll start by having a look, and there's no order of preference, so just the order that we're working through today. So we'll start by exploring smaller wards with 4 larger community boards that don't align to the ward structure entirely, in that they combine up to 2 wards in some instances. Option number 2 that we're looking at is an adjusted version of the status quo. So most of the boundaries are similar to our current representation arrangements, with a couple of exceptions that I'll go through. And this model has 4 community boards. In particular, a Paekakariki Raumati community board that is different to the current community board setup or arrangements. Number 3 is again an adjusted version of the status quo with 4 community boards, with a Parapara Umu Raumati community board that is subdivided, but you can also have it as a community board that is not subdivided. It doesn't affect the model that we'll be looking at. So happy for me to move on? Does that sound that you agree that that's what we were asked to look at? Great. So small wards. So just to recap, the small wards model has 6 smaller wards. So it has an Otaki ward, Waikanae Beach, Waikanae Town, Parapara Umu Beach, Parapara Umu Town, and Paekakariki Raumati ward. So the names are something we'll come back to later in the session, once we get a steer from you on your preferred option. This option has 10 councillors plus the mayor. It's a mixed model, so it has 7 ward councillors, with 2 in Parapara Umu Beach and 3 district-wide councillors. In terms of the overlay of community boards, we're looking at 4 community boards, 1 in Paekakariki Raumati, 1 that combines Waikanae Beach and Waikanae, 1 that combines Parapara Umu Beach and Parapara Umu, and 1 community board for Otaki. So I'll just jump, while we're looking at the map, I'll just recap on the boundaries of this one. So there are some tweaks to the boundaries from the option that we looked at early in the process when we were discussing the initial proposal. And the reason for these tweaks is to reflect community feedback around our communities of interest, as well as to best achieve the fair representation requirement. So when we picked up the small wards option and we did some fine sandpapering around the boundaries and looked at whether they were appropriate, we found that the boundary intersected Raumati Village, which was a problem, so we had to look at how we could best address that. And the Raumati boundary has been adjusted to Tui Road and then to follow Wharimaku Stream inland. It moves along Tui Road and then into the airport area, and so includes some of the inland Raumati roads. Another change that you may recall from the option that we looked at early in the process is that we've moved the large mesh block to the west of Otaki into Otaki, which is similar to our current representation model. And we have also moved Te Horo into Waikanae, which is roughly 1,000 people, to try and balance the fair representation requirement that each ward is plus or minus 10% the same electoral population. So those are the boundary tweaks. I'll move on to the numbers. And you should all have these numbers in the handout.
Janet, you got something?
So for this model, Te Horo is in Waikanae. And the reason for that, so we worked up, in the work that we've done leading up to these sessions, we worked up 3 different options. So one was the original option, one was one where Te Horo was in Otaki, and there was a slightly different boundary down in Raumati, which was, I think, slightly north, if I'm correct, and the numbers for that are for Otaki Waikanae and down in Raumati as well. There it's minus around 25, 26, might even be 28%. So the numbers are the non-compliance is, I guess, worse than the status quo. And so we felt that that wasn't a good option in balancing out communities of interest, fair representation, and effective representation, which is of course the brief that we've been asked to look at in reviewing our representation arrangements.
Just on that communities of interest though, did anything come through in any of our research that Te Horo identifies as Waikanae?
I believe there were some submissions on that. Emma, can I hand over to you just to speak to that specific question on whether there were any submissions around people in Te Horo identifying with Waikanae more than Otaki?
I don't think I can say off the top of my head, sorry, but I can have a look at I brought my computer with me, so I can have a look while the discussion continues, if you like.
Certainly, in the early engagement that you did, you might recall we did a survey, a letterbox drop of some of the roads in that area, and we received a small number of responses based on the number of mail drops, and half of those said we identify with Otaki, and half said we identify with Waikanae. So it was very mixed, but we haven't done any specific engagement other than targeted digital campaigns through the consultation period that has looked at Te Horo.
We did have Royden Samuel come in and talk to it. His family's been in Kapiti and in that area for 80 odd years and was more in line with Waikanae and the southern part of Kapiti than Otaki. Quite strongly as well.
Yeah.
Quite a passionate man.
One submitter.
So, just to clarify, looking, because it's a lot easier when you have a look at the maps up on the wall, the light blue box extends through to Te Horo Beach around Rodney Avenue and so forth. So that comes under Waikanae Beach. Obviously, I think the key point we need to not get hung up on is name to be confirmed, because people at Te Horo wouldn't want to be referred to as Waikanae Beach. But I think the other important part is that Waikanae town also absorbs the eastern side of Te Horo, east of the what looks like sort of roughly State Highway 1-ish, give or take. So that's basically two communities of Te Horo, both going to the south into Waikanae. Correct?
I think my understanding is that most of Te Horo is absorbed in the Waikanae Beach ward, the light blue ward, on this model. Andrea, did you want to jump in and say anything else about that boundary, or you're happy with that?
I think the easiest thing is to look at the map, but my interpretation of that, and I'm not too familiar with Te Horo, is that most of it is in the blue. You see how it juts out, that's over the other side of the state highway. Hadfield Road is in the pink, if people know where Hadfield Road is.
I suppose we'd want to hear from both the Otaki Ward Councillor and the Waikanae Ward Councillor. Jocelyn? No views on that? No views on that?
I'm just listening.
Given that you asked me, I couldn't see Waikanae residents being as opposed to this as I could see Te Horo residents. And I'm trying to recall back to the submissions, and like Emma, I couldn't hand on heart say they said this or that, but for me the more resounding message coming through was status quo. This is change, and I'm just trying to think how I would explain that to residents within Te Horo on either side of, the beach side or the rural side, of how they now become part of a Waikanae ward, whatever name we call that. They are now sort of going to the south. And I don't think I could hand on heart say that there was a compelling case for that through the submissions. So I think it probably means more to Te Horo residents than it does to Waikanae. I could understand, I mean, Jocelyn will have her own views, but there's representation for Waikanae either way under this model or the other. I think the change is more significant for Te Horo residents. and I've been pondering on it, had a look at the map, because I know you're going to look for a stair soon. And I think the safer option for me, trying to reflect the views of my community, would be for the, potentially going to the more along the lines of the status quo than the option that you've got in front of you. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Jocelyn.
Yeah, I will make some comments. So, so I think I hear exactly what James is saying, and I think when you've got a residential ward with a little bit of rural area, the rural part of it tends to be forgotten. But I think by having a ward that is along the beach, there are some similarities in the issues and I suppose the mindset, and probably being slightly more rural in some areas. So I have to admit, in terms of the way it's been divided, I'm not, I could see it could work, but it will be an adjustment for people. But saying that, further down the line, I would like to suggest 2 separate community boards. And I suppose the other comment too, I think the comment was made about people were consulted on. I don't think people around Houtree were consulted. It was just mainly that very small area north of so Tihapua Road wasn't consulted on. It was actually just that very small area where the roads were split in half. So there's a lot of people who weren't consulted on anything like this.
Could I just be clear, Mike? Sorry. If I could just be clear, and I'm not too sure whether your comment... Sorry, wait for the microphone because it's live stream. Sorry, Jocelyn, if I could just be clear, and I'm not sure if your comment was in response to what I said, and to be really clear, I'm not taking offence to it. When I refer to consulted, the whole community was consulted through the open process, whether they chose to put in a submission or not, and that's what I refer to in terms of the feedback we received from the consultation.
Yeah, so I was referring to a comment, I think, from another councillor. I think the comment was that by Sarah that they had been consulted pre. Yes, yeah, where that was actually only a very, very small percentage of the area.
Could I just make a comment that so this is different from the boundary in the initial proposal that we obviously consulted on. So one of the questions was about do people agree with the boundaries? My understanding from reading the analysis and submissions is that most of the feedback that we got around boundaries related to the combined Waikanae Parapara Umu ward, and people told us that they didn't like that. However, we didn't receive an overwhelming number of submissions who said we don't like Te Horo in Otaki because, of course, with the initial proposal, the boundary moves to the just south of Te Hapua Road. So Otaki, Te Horo is mostly in Otaki. So people through the consultation didn't reject that. We didn't consult on moving the boundaries so Te Horo is in Waikanae. And so and I'll hand over to Emma in just a sec. So my understanding is that we didn't receive specific feedback on that. Emma, do you want to speak to that further?
Thank you. And yes, it is just another layer of detail to what you've said, as opposed to being opposed to what you've said. I've gone back through some of the interview notes that I had from the people that I spoke with originally, a couple of whom were from Te Horo. They didn't mention anything one way or the other, although they did say that they did more things in Waikanae than they did in Otaki. I've also done a word search on the submissions that were loaded into, so not the supplementary submissions yet, just the main submissions that appeared in Have Your Say. And there's a bit of both ways. There's a bit of Te Horo. I think Te Horo is more Waikanae. A couple of other people have said, I think Te Horo, maybe Te Horo, like this person here says, Te Horo might have more in common with Waikanae than with with Otaki than suburban Waikanae. One of the things that I think is probably worth thinking about when it comes to the smaller wards option is whether or not Te Horo might feel more like Waikanae Beach than Otaki as opposed to Waikanai or Otaki, because I think it's that beach element that they might feel some commonality with, that more sort of rural beachy side. I don't know. So there's some stuff in here. I can keep digging if you'd like me to.
Councillor Butler.
I was having a discussion earlier today, and I supported the idea of having the beach wards kind of connected. But in reflection with this boundary, I think that the Te Horo Beach settlement itself, it aligns more so with Otaki in its daily movements, you know, whereas the newer part, the new subdivided farms and things around Pukenamu Road and Te Hapua would potentially relate more to Waikanai. But I think the old established area of Te Horo Beach is definitely more centric to Otaki.
Mm-hmm.
That's my feeling.
Councillor Elliott.
And I would absolutely agree with Angela. There are a lot of new and younger families, another resurgence of new families in Te Horo Beach right now, and they are all under Otaki bases for their education, from kindergarten and playgroup right through to college. And that, from my experience 12 years living there, was the basis of the community, was the kids and their families in education.
Right. Councillor Compton.
I was just going to chip in here and say the other thing we've got to think about in terms of these boundaries is what's going to happen to those sort of local movements when Peka Peka to Otaki opens, because that may potentially change things. You'll have commuters who will potentially be living in that Te Horo Beach and Te Horo area will be potentially using Waikanai more, because that's where they will have to access the road to get to their homes. And that's until the trains get extended north to Otaki. So that's just something to bear in mind around that there. And I guess the other thing that just cropped up in my mind while I'm looking at this is if you compare that the Otaki ward in that with 8,900 people for having one councillor, that's actually a better ratio of constituents to councillors than Otaki has at the moment, which I think is 10,900 or something. So it might be worse off in comparative to the district as a whole under this model, but it's actually better off than it is under the existing model, if that makes sense. Yes, a lot more positive. Yeah.
But I suppose, you know, we live in the real world, we can think in those directions of the new road and what the impact will be. But my understanding is the Commission requires us to look at what is now. Just a point. Yeah, moving on.
Okay, so
Hold on.
Oh,
Councillor Randall.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I agree with what the remarks Emma made, and also what Councillor Pravanov has been saying. I just want.
all right. So I think you've already. I'll just move on to numbers. So just to comment that, to touch on what I said earlier, that this model, the way that it looks, notwithstanding comments about the boundary in Te Horo and Waikanai, this model is compliant with the plus or minus 10% rule, with Otaki slightly underrepresented, Waikanai town, Pakakuri Raumati as well. However, within the plus or minus 10%. Just to reiterate, we did look at the option of having Te Horo and Otaki, but the thing to note is that it's significantly non-compliant at either end as well. So in the 20 zone. What you asked us to look at was an overlay of 4 community boards with that were larger, that combine either 1 or 2 wards. And with what we've done is we've done that, and we've done it with the possibility of subdivisions that align to the ward boundaries of this model. So to run through, there's an Otaki Community Board proposed. There is a Waikanae Beach Community Board, a Parapara Umu Beach or Parapara Umu Community Board, and a Paekakariki Raumati Community Board on this model. So the Paekakariki Raumati would be its own separate community board. You could have a Parapara Umu Beach, Parapara Umu separate community board with no subdivisions, or you could have it subdivided, which is the red line that is through the middle. Similar with Waikanae Beach, you could either have one large community board, or you could have a subdivision along the pink line. So you should have the numbers in your handout of the subdivision. You'll recall from earlier in the week that for subdivided community boards, they need to comply with a plus or minus 10% rule for fair representation. With subdivided community boards, you would be able to ensure that there is representation on a community board, both in the case of the larger, the Parapara Umu Beach and Parapara Umu and Waikanae Beach, Waikanae community boards, that you have representation from each ward on the community board. So just to run through the proposed numbers that we've worked up for the two community boards that have a proposed subdivision, starting with Waikanae Beach, Waikanae Town. So we're looking at 4 elected community board members, 1 appointed ward councillor, which is a decision for you to make today as to whether you would want to appoint a ward councillor back as with the current model. And for each, for Waikanae Beach and for Waikanae Town, you would have 2 elected community board members to each. So that is a total of 5 community board members and appointments. In terms of the numbers of the proposed subdivision, if that is what you, if you like the idea of a subdivision, they are compliant with the plus or minus 10% rule. So there's no issue there for Waikanae Beach, Waikanae Town. In terms of Parapara Umu Beach, Parapara Umu Town, so based on the numbers and the population, we're proposing 5 elected community board members and 2 appointed ward councillors. The reason for 2 ward councillors is so that all ward councillors could be appointed back to a community board. In terms of the subdivision between the beach and town, it is slightly non-compliant with Parapara Umu Town being overrepresented by 12.93%. So outside of the plus or minus 10% rule, which would mean that subdivision would be automatically referred to the Local Government Commission if this was the model that you decide to adopt. Just to recap, you know, there's an option in this model around subdivision. So if you preferred, there's an option of a larger separate community board combining Waikanae Beach and Waikanae and Parapara Umu Beach and Parapara Umu. So that's the model. Unless you have any specific questions about that, it might be a good time for me to hand over to Emma just to recap on her take on this option with the overlay of either larger subdivided community boards or separate community boards, but 4 in total, and how that aligns with the design principles and consultation feedback.
Councillor Bravanel.
Thank you. So I'm actually quite amazed actually that there's only 1 appointed ward councillor for the Waikanae Community Board, well, you know, for the joined double Waikanae Community Board area. In the current model, there's it's about 14,000 odd people, 14 and a half, and here it's now 1,000 more people. So 1 ward councillor is going to be even more stretched than what they currently are. I don't know what the figures are for Parapara and Raumati, for the other option, but yeah, so that's my take on my immediate concern that springs to mind. Yeah. Apologies, we've been under getting this together
between Tuesday and Thursday has been incredibly tight. So we can certainly look at that. And I can see that there's obviously a Waikanae Beach and a Waikanae ward councillor with the small wards option. So there would be the option to have both of those councillors appointed back to that to the Waikanae Beach Community Board. And that wouldn't affect the numbers, the fair representation requirement. To be clear, that's just a decision for councillors of how they want the community boards to look.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and you asked Emma the question.
Sorry.
Councillor Randall.
Yeah, just clarification. I mean, I have no objections overall, but Paikokariki and Raumati, they're two different distinct communities. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. So are you proposing a community board combining those two?
Yes, so it would be a Paikakariki Raumati community board. And it's just one. So in terms of the three options that we're looking at today, there are obviously different ways of looking at a smaller
No,
ward.
this is okay.
Yeah,
you've explained it, thank you, but I just thought the Raumati people will not be happy.
Emma. The question that you asked Emma.
Yeah, hand over to you, Emma. Are you happy to speak to the design principles of this model?
I sure can. The small wards one, first of all. The small wards one. Okay, so the small wards one. What I've done, and you'll see in the handout there, is what I've tried to do is speak to each of the aspects of the arrangements. So the first aspect that I've pulled out there is that this has 10 councillors and a mayor. That was directly tested in your consultation round, so I can speak very easily to that one. It was well supported. When you asked specifically about the size of council, do you agree with having 10 councillors and a mayor? About 2/3 of people agreed or strongly agreed. The comments related to it being big enough for diversity, but not too, and so that you're not spreading councillors too thin, yet small enough to be efficient and not create cliques. And that sentiment certainly came through also in the earlier round of research as well. In terms of the mixed model, again, that was tested and supported. The value of the mixed model was a really strong sentiment in both the earlier round of research and this round of research. When you ask the question about, in the consultation, about do you agree with 5 ward councillors and 5 district-wide councillors, and when I dug into the comments to try and figure out who was supportive of the mixed model, it was about 2/3 that were supportive of the mixed model, and I can go into comments about that as well, but I'd say that aspect of this option is also supported. We didn't specifically test, obviously, 6 wards and 7 councillors. It does align with the design principles, and also the perception, people's perception about how those design principles are achieved. So I think that's aligning really nicely. Most notably, it reflects the design principle around distinct geographic communities of interest well. It supports the likelihood of councillors coming from across the district because of those smaller wards, and also supporting councillors to reach out from and hear from the community. So those are 3 design principles that I think are very well supported by this particular option. In consultation, you'll remember that about 2/3 disagreed or strongly disagreed with the proposal of a combined ward for Waikanae and Paraparaumu. So this, is not that. It pulls apart those 2 things again. And in that feedback, we could see that many people strongly expressed that those 2 communities were different from each other. If we then take that on to our 7 ward councillors and 3 district-wide councillors, actually, I feel like I want to say a little bit more about the communities of interest, but it really comes down to the comparison between the 2. Is now an appropriate time to say that, or should I? Yeah. Okay. So on in the page 3 of the handout that I've given you, I go into a little bit more detail about just thinking about the distinct communities of interest, which is our first design principle. It came through really strongly in both the earlier design research and the consultation that people really want each community of interest to have specific representation. And we heard in the earlier design research that those different geographic community hubs, those pearls in your string of pearl, are what people really talk about in that. So they did talk about Waikanae Beach being distinct from Waikanae Town. They definitely, as we heard in the consultation, talked about Paraparaumu being distinct from Waikanae. We also heard Raumati being distinct from Paikakariki, and to a lesser degree Raumati or perhaps Raumati Beach, Raumati Village being distinct from Raumati South. So those distinctions at that kind of lower level were alive and well, and particularly in the first earlier stages of design research. We also heard a lot in the consultation, as you know, about different geographic communities, and the distinctions and difference is important. Obviously, we heard that very loudly with regard to Waikanae being different from Paraparaumu, Otaki being distinct, rural needing a specific voice. I went back through and we had a look for Waikanae Beach specifically in the consultation submissions. Couldn't find it as distinct by many people. It was more, the heat of the submissions was about the comparison between Paraparaumu and Waikanae. So they pulled those two things apart. So I think that level of kind of where people see their communities of interest geographically and what they think of as the pearls in your string of pearls, our string of pearls, is relevant when we, I guess, talking between those two different options, the smaller wards option and the adjusted status quo option. When it comes to 7 ward councillors and 3 district-wide councillors, we didn't specifically test this. But obviously we got to hear some stuff when we specifically tested the 5-5 ratio. So when we tested the 5-5 ratio, about 61% agreed or strongly disagreed. And if I look at those people who disagreed, about 61% agreed or strongly agreed. And of those who disagreed or strongly disagreed, at least 29 people wanted more ward councillors and at least 31 people wanted all ward councillors, so they would have preferred to go to an all-ward model. So in that way, I was thinking about Dale's comment from a technical point of view. Can you iterate, it has to stem from I believe the changes have to stem from the submissions. So if I think about whether or not that sort of technicality is reached, I wanted to let you know that iterating the initial proposal to a 7-3 ratio was raised by submitters. It was a minority view for sure, but it's there and it's in there. And certainly some people wanted more ward councillors than district-wide councillors. We looked at the community boards as well. I don't know if it's more useful for me to go. What do you reckon, Sarah?
Yep.
I think it would be helpful for you to talk about the larger subdivided community boards.
Okay, larger subdivided community boards. Excuse me. I would say this was partly tested by your consultation. So obviously the consultation document really directly asked about community boards, and you heard about 2/3 of people say we disagree or strongly disagree with the removal of community boards. So we tested whether or not community boards should be there or not be there in people's minds. But we didn't at all, specifically or even indirectly talk about community boards where the boundaries of a community board are larger than a ward. So I haven't got a lot to go on there. What I have got to go on is, if you refer to additional note number 2, we didn't test larger and we didn't test subdivided community boards. From memory, my colleague Anne and I, we couldn't remember any submitter asking for either larger community boards or subdivided community boards, but we didn't want to rely on our memory. We, as in the time that we had, we tried to go back through all the submissions and have a look. We were only able to do a quick scan. We've got about 20 supplementary submissions to go, so this document's definitely a work in progress. But our scan so far, and that's over 500 submissions that we've scanned, we still couldn't see anything that specifically relates to either subdividing or what I'm thinking of as a larger community board. what we do know is that lots of comments about community boards relate to their perceived value being about connecting council with the grassroots of my local community. So the comments and the way that they're written really make me think of a smaller unit rather than a larger unit. So they want, we do know that lots of people want more localised, more dedicated representatives for their area in their local community. We also know that when we talked about combining communities into a larger ward, which I know is about wards, but still wards, that was seen as a step backwards for democracy. So this kind of unit of representation seems very strongly linked with the idea of democracy, as you asked us to drill into the other day. So what I could speculate on, one might speculate that people would prefer community boards to not encompass multiple geographic communities of interest. I think that would be a fair speculation. We might also speculate that smaller communities might welcome the concept of a subdivided community board if it ensures that they have dedicated seats coming from their community. So for example, I think there were only a couple of people who mentioned Raumati, but if I think about that in the Raumati Paikakariki area, that might help to have people feel that it's more local representation, that my local place is going to be represented, provided that it doesn't get in the way of us ensuring high calibre representatives. That was still an important thread for people. So if the unit of sort of representation is so small that it means that you're far less likely to get good, high quality, high calibre representatives, then that becomes a problem for people. Just another note on community boards. We did have quite a few people when they were saying, please don't remove the community boards. They said, that it can't be an argument about money. I know that's easy to say when you're not juggling a budget, but they sort of said, look, democracy should be the more important driver rather than cost or even lowering bureaucracy. It should be about democracy, not bureaucracy. Shall I tell you more about the status quo option then, or are we not quite there?
So we haven't gone through that yet, so it might be helpful for me to take councillors through that, unless there's any questions about that before I jump in.
Doesn't seem to be. Councillor Pravanov? In the small wards.
Any questions that you might have about the small wards option, and particularly Emma's comments on how this option reflects the consultation feedback and design principles.
Yeah, the meeting.
Yeah, I've got my mic's red, so I might as well just take this opportunity. So a couple of questions and also just a few clarifications so things are crystal clear in my head as well. So in terms of the small wards option and the community board kind of lens over that, that's when you're talking about the Paikakiriki Raumati Community Board? Oh, are we going to be able to... Yes? Yes. Yeah, cool. So I just...
Yes.
They identify with that, and they're proud to live in Raumati, and we saw people really keen on a Raumati community board. So I'm wondering why that hasn't been proposed as an option, whether there are things that kind of restrict that from coming to the table?
There's other treatments for Raumati as part of the other options we've got to discuss today. So this is just one.
So this was our understanding of the steer that the table gave us on Tuesday. So that's why we've come back with this option now. But in the next option, as Andrew has said, there is a treatment of Raumati in that way. We could. We're at your will to consider whatever it is you ask us to, but this is what we thought we were coming back with today, and apologies if we've missed something there.
I would still be quite keen for a separate Raumati community board to be considered, for us to then look at a Paikakiriki community board, Raumati community board, Parapara Umu community board, if that's an option to be to be somehow worked in.
I think it'll be useful to come back to this when we are discussing both
And
models.
the other point that I would make is I think we, at the session on Tuesday, we had a brief discussion of this, and one of the questions that I'd asked Emma to look into was how much feedback there was around a separate Raumati Community Board, and I actually can't recall what your answer was. Sorry, Emma, so maybe you can give it again.
The answer was there wasn't a lot in the written, but I wonder if it came through in the verbal. It did. It was there. It just wasn't a strong theme at all, but it was there. And I get the sense it might have come through in the verbal submissions a little bit more.
But I think if we move on, you'll get to see the shape of it at that point. Yeah.
So you can reintroduce that at a later point. Who have I got now? Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Just a couple of things quickly. I checked the guide from the Local Government Commission, and they do say we can take into account the interests of future generations under point 9.8 of their guide. So we don't just have to consider the current situation in the district. But my question was about, because I've snuck ahead on the homework and had a look, and obviously you've got a subdivided Paraparaumu Raumati Community Board under the status quo option, and my understanding from Tuesday was that we were going to have that option come back with the small wards. So my question would be, can we have a look at that in terms of how that would break down for the small wards option?
So that wasn't what we heard from Friday. Just reiterating on what Janice has just said. So we haven't worked up a subdivided Paekakariki Raumati Community Board for the small wards option. We have done that for the adjusted status quo option, which we'll look at shortly. That is something we could look at. If we did look at that, we'd need to look at the plus or minus 10% rule. Which, knowing what the population of Paekakariki is, would affect the number
I was meaning Paraparaumu Raumati, not Paekakariki.
Oh, sorry, for the small wards option.
Yeah, so under the adjusted status quo, we've got that Paraparaumu Raumati subdivided, but we don't have it as for the small wards option.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that, and I guess there would be a possibility of overlaying the current community board setup to the small wards, which is reflected in that. There might be some more discrepancies in terms of how the community board boundaries fit with the ward boundaries. So it might be a bit more tricky if you were wanting to have a model that could be easily understood by a community. But we haven't worked that up for today. So it might be we can come back to that, but it might be helpful to see what we have looked at and then to balance up the options just in the interest of time. And then come back to that at the end where we get your final direction on what model you're wanting us to go with.
Cool. Right, who's next? Councillor Buswell.
I just wanted to comment on your additional notes number 1, and that you didn't get much feedback from Waikanae Beach wanting to be a separate kind of entity, which I think is quite funny because they've got a residents group that's very active, that probably works quite closely, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jocelyn, with the Waikanae Community Board already. So I think that might actually be quite a good example of how a residents group within a ward can work closely with a community board to have their voice heard, and for the residents to feel like they have a voice as well as having a community board. Just an observation.
No, since the question was asked, I think it's useful to have your reaction. Just.
So thank you, Angela. So when the chair of the Waikanae Residents Society actually came and spoke to us, I asked them a very specific question. If there were no community boards, would that society be able to take over that role? He said very, very clearly that they didn't have the resources or the time to do it.
No, I think the,
What I'm getting at
yeah.
is at the moment there's two entities. You've got a community board and you've got a Waikanai Beach residents group, and they seem to be working together.
Oh, yes, they do.
Quite nice.
Yes, they do work together, but certainly the community board takes a far bigger role.
Oh yeah.
I suppose the
They
same.
feel like they've got a voice through the Waikanai Beach residents group.
If you actually, I think there's only about 200 members of that group, where there's a lot more people. I can't remember how many residents are down at the beach. It's only a very, very small percentage, very small percentage of the beach community who are members. So it's actually it is in some respect they do a grand job, but they actually are a minority representation of the Waikanai Beach residents.
Okay, you done?
Sure, Jackie.
Jackie?
Thanks. Bernie, I just sent you an email of the outline of one of the proposals that got turned down 2 days ago, just so you can have a read and understand it, because a lot of the outcomes that we're seeing now are as a result of trying to force our communities into the plus minus 10% rule. And it's really unfortunate to see, because the proposals that we had on the table it doesn't have to require, if it's 10 at large councillors, there's no need for a plus minus 10% rule at all.
So Councillor Elliott, are you asking staff the
No,
question?
I'm just letting Bernie know some background information so you can read that at your leisure. It's really unfortunate, but my question is for Emma and I guess staff. You know how you talk about the design principles and everything, and there are responses, for instance, from 5 people saying that they want a Raumati community board. What was far more important in the submission feedback was the rich content, and that included a whole lot of problems identified and concerns that people wanted fixing. And a lot of those things aren't being addressed in the models here at all. In fact, they're kind of been made, it looks like a little bit worse. And especially that's highlighted with whether or not there is a Raumati community board on here, and clearly there isn't, and it's a real shame, because that's an improvement that could have been made with this model, with this change that's not being made. And frankly, I've got a list of 9 improvements that people have asked for that are not being made with these models. So it's a real shame that things have been forced around the way they are.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, can I respond?
Yeah.
Look, have you got a question?
I'm responding to Councillor Elliott's questions to me.
I think she said that you can have a respond at your own leisurely time. This is not a leisurely time.
Thank you. My response is that...
Councillor Elliott, I am chairing this meeting. So...
Are you shutting me up, Mr. Mayor?
No, I'm asking Councillor Elliott not to chair the meeting.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Right.
Can you ask Councillor McCann to do the same?
Look, can you've got to respond, because I think the mistake I made was to allow Councillor Pravnov to respond to Councillor Buswell. I'll give you the last response.
Okay, thank you. It's just a legal thing. The plus or minus 10%, to me, and I think maybe Councillor Compton may agree, it's irrelevant. What the Local Government Commission seems to be more interested in is communities of interest. They gave an example of a plus or minus 50% somewhere in Christchurch.
I think you know that it's a question of priorities that you go to. You're right that the highest priority is the community of interest, but the fact that the plus or minus 10% is an added factor to consider. Thank you very much. Next person, Councillor Holliday.
Thank you. My question around the small wards is to do with the community board that's not mentioned here, which is around Raumati Paikokoriki, because that would also need to be fundamentally a subdivision as well, in relation to what the situation is now, based on the 2 options that we've got here. And the other question I have around that is, with regards to Paikokoriki and its current situation, it must be off the chart with the local government commission with regards to the plus or minus rule?
Can I respond
Yep.
to that? So when we get to looking at the two options that we have for the adjusted status quo, we've worked up a subdivision for Paikākāriki Raumati, as well as Parapara Umu Raumati. For the Paikākāriki Raumati Community Board, because of the population being just under 2,000 people, I think, compared to, I think, around 8,000 off the top, the ratio of elected members on that subdivided community board needs to be 5 for Raumati to 1 for Paikākāriki. So,
Sarah, can I just
yes,
interrupt, please?
yep.
You're not actually quite answering his question.
Yeah.
You can set up community boards for any size you like. If you get into subdivisions, the plus or minus 10% rule applies. So we tend to be, I think through all of this conversation, we're starting to lose sight of some of the basic issues and principles that apply from the Local Government Commission. So when you say it's out of the ballpark compared to others, yes it is, but you can do that.
That's cool.
If it's a community board. If it's a subdivided community board, the plus or minus 10% applies. To answer to you and Councillor Randall, whenever you breach the plus or minus 10%, it's going to go to the LGC for a ruling.
That's cool.
And that's okay, that's just a consideration that you have to bear in mind.
Oh, I appreciate that, because I think at no stage have we actually talked about how far off the chart Paikākāriki is and how that affects things. But I do come back to that small ward situation with regards to the situation with Raumati and Paikākāriki. So we could make up, I mean, are you talking 2 single community boards, like one for Paikākāriki, one for Raumati, or are we talking a combination of Raumati South and Paikākāriki, all in one community board, for the small ward option?
For Paikākāriki Raumati?
Yeah.
For the option that we have worked out? Or
for
an
the
alternate?
small ward option.
Yeah, what we have worked up is one community board that covers Paikākāriki Raumati. As I mentioned earlier, you could look at a subdivision, and we haven't looked at that. It would probably be something similar or further even along in terms of the division of numbers. So, I imagine it would be 5-1 or 6-1 or something in that vicinity if you were to look at a subdivision. But at the moment, the community board that's proposed combines the two areas. There are other ways that you can slice and dice it. The plus or minus 10% rule only matters if you subdivide. Otherwise, you can establish community boards for different geographic communities of interest.
So, again, sorry, I just need to get this clear in my head. What we're proposing is an unsubdivided community board that would be Paikākāriki, Raumati and Raumati South.
Yes.
It's not on here.
No, but it's on the other one.
No, it's not.
So if you...
No, it's Raumati and Raumati. There's a definition. The other one part's Raumati, one part's Raumati South. They call them both Raumati.
You should have, you do have, I think, in your handout, a map for small wards, 4 community boards, 2 with subdivisions. And so the large blue dotted lines represent the community board boundaries.
Yep.
So there are 4 different community boards. And so for Paikākāriki Raumati, that is one community board that currently is not subdivided. In terms of where the boundary is between Raumati and Parapara Umu, the boundary runs along Tui Road and then follows Wharimaku Stream inland.
But we're not talking about the status quo.
I realise that. But that's quite a substantial change from the status quo.
It takes Raumati away from Parapara Umu from a community board perspective, and it combines that with Paikākāriki, which is currently.
One thing, if we go with the small ward option, okay,
yeah, it is.
then that would be what we're talking about. Okay.
Councillor Holiday, are we sorted? Councillor Holiday, are you sorted?
Sorry.
You are. Councillor Holbrook.
I'm just a little bit confused about the subdivisions. What I thought we'd asked for was a subdivided Raumati Parapara Umu Community Board. In order to address the submissions that people wanted representation from Raumati, I wasn't expecting subdivisions anywhere else. Are the rest of the subdivisions happening because once you have subdivisions in one place, everywhere has to comply with the 10% plus minus 10% rule? I was under the impression that you just had to comply with the plus minus 10% rule within the area that you were subdividing.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, you can have a little, what I thought you could have,
Mm-hmm.
so just correct
Mm-hmm.
me, is a little community board for Paikakariki, a community board for Otaki, community board for Waikanae.
Mm-hmm.
They're free of any kind of
Mhm.
rules.
Mm-hmm.
Then we take the area Ramati Paraparumu
Mm-hmm.
and subdivide that according to the plus minus
Mhm.
10% rule.
Yep.
So why have we ended up with Paikakariki Ramati Community Board?
So the scenario you've just outlined is what we're exploring next in this adjusted status quo. So what we thought we heard from you on Tuesday was that for the small wards option we would look, because we heard that 6 community boards might be too many, which is what we'd originally looked at, so that the community boards align to the ward boundaries. What was tabled was exploring larger community boards that cover either 1 or 2 ward boundaries for this. So as Janice said, apologies if we misheard, but certainly what you've outlined is addressed in the next 2 options. And I just wonder, in the interest of time, whether we might want to move on to those so that you understand
okay.
what we're putting on the table, and then can come back and look at the 3 options from a bird's eye view, having seen
Chief
it all.
Executive, you got something to say?
Yeah, what I think I heard you all say is that we were trying to avoid having different wards and community board boundaries.
Hmm.
And so you can see some examples of how they've tried to make that work, and I think you can all see that that's probably not going to work for you.
So basically where we are at now, we've asked the hard questions on the small wards. We then go to the adjusted status quo, and then we have an overall assessment. You all want a break?
Oh, what a good idea.
10 minutes?
Yep.
Did you hear this?
We'll get there, thank you. I appreciate that.
No, luckily we've got only dealing with 2. Imagine we had 3 or 4 more to deal with.
It's been quite a long